Hello, I am going to talk about OT supply chain today, and I'm very excited to be here because I think this, for me, is a very exciting topic. As it just mentioned, I've written a book on the topic because I absolutely love it, but I'm very passionate about it with my background as a software developer and also working for a company that provides many critical infrastructure products at Schneider Electric. So the supply chain, for all of you, if you did not see the presentation I've done previously at S4 on a supply chain security initiatives that we do at Schneider Electric, there's many components to it. There's 13 plus initiatives that we have, but as part of that, we also are literally part of this supply chain and everybody that we bring into it. So the supply chain, it seems simple, right? You've got suppliers, products, things get shipped, but it really looks like this. It is so many people, so many thousands upon thousands of suppliers, and they all have suppliers, and there's people and things moving around, especially when you're looking at operational technology products. It's really complex. And as part of that, that means this is the pieces that we have to put together for these various products. We have a lot of products that have operating systems, just like your phones, right? You have operating systems that come from a third party. We don't write those. Proprietary firmware, what that means is something that we write or anybody writes specifically for that product or software or system. And then you have third-party open source, and we hear a lot about that today. Like, who wrote it? Where did it come from? What's it doing? You know, there is a lot that we're doing in relations to the software bill of materials that I'll talk about, but understanding what's in there, that's part of my supply chain. Then you have third-party hardware. We hear about those, you know, what chips are in it? Where is it being manufactured? Who's actually designed it? Where is it all coming from? And then you have the manufacturing and the people. So between all the different lines of manufacturing of things going on, it's not just in a single plant, right? You've got the chips that might be manufactured in many different countries and locations, but you also have different pieces and components put together in another plant that could be going to a different place. So all of that is part of that supply chain, and then everybody that's involved with the people that are in it. It could be software developers with backgrounds like myself. It could be somebody that's designing those chips, engineers. It could be people running the systems that are building the products, all of that. So you're talking millions upon millions of points in a supply chain. And each one of these need to be really thought about from a security aspect. So not just supply chain, but supply chain security. So for example, does it have a trusted platform module chip? You know, what is the actual manufacturing process that's working through that? So I'm gonna be talking about that today to not teach you how to do supply chain, but really what kinds of things do you need to think about or that your suppliers should be thinking about when you're doing all of this, you know, selection process. So I geared it today to talk about that. So the reason why this is important is because I have suppliers and I have to decide, you know, are they trustworthy? And the same goes for every one of you. When you go out and buy something for your home or when you go buy something for your business, you need to think about it. Please don't be buying it on eBay. I heard that as a comment that a lot of product gets bought on eBay. You don't know the supply chain of that because it could have been compromised after the fact. So let's talk about this. So what is your role? My role is a lot of in the producer, vendor, manufacturer, but I'm also in these other roles where I'm a purchaser or a user. And this is where, let's say, a lot of you are sitting, and I'm going to be talking about that. What do you need to be looking for from a supply chain? So I'm going to start with a few basics. For those in the room, you know, if you already know this, you can ignore it for a moment. IT and OT differences. The one thing that I really like to point out, which most anybody in operational technology, but this is an on-ramp, so people who are listening to it later, operational technology lasts decades, which means things like the PKI, the public key infrastructure, certificates and things like that, are generally 30 to 40 years, which is different than IT. We also think about the protocols. You know, there's a lot of overlapping protocols now, but there's still some unique protocols in the OT space, along with data types and security. And there's quite a bit on security, especially at this conference, talking about operational technology security. But the last piece I like to always talk about is just the different kinds of maintenance and updates. And that means that not only do you have products that you're purchasing that you want to maintain, but likely you aren't going to be there in 20 years when it still needs to be going on. So I'm going to talk about that longevity, you know, and where things need to be because from a standpoint of, you know, when you're selecting a supplier, you need to think about how are you going to continue to work with that supplier or know things are going on so that you can perform secure by operations as part of all of this to maintain that length of time. So can you use your IT vendors? Yes, you can. Of course you can. But many IT vendors have not specialized in the, let's just say, the uniqueness that is operational technology. So again, you know, think about, we're going to be talking about what you need to consider from a supply chain, but I just wanted to highlight some of the pieces that, especially as operational technology vendors, you know, our supply chains, we have to be thinking about them all the time and what we're doing as processes. That means that we need to understand our customers. We need to understand safety. We need to understand critical infrastructure. We need to understand the entire system and environment. And so, of course, there's processes and thoughts on secure by design, but it's also things like cyber-informed engineering and many other kinds of concepts that are out there and practices that OT vendor will actually do as part of all of this. And so one of the things that I like to point out is the ISA IEC 62443 series. So I think everybody who's been in operational technology a long time, especially if you're on the creation side of products, or if you're actually certifying any systems, you're probably familiar with this, and hopefully many of you are certified in it. But as a supplier, one of our key tenets is this 4-1 standard, which is the secure development lifecycle. And I'm going to point out a little bit later why that's really critical for us. But in part of the 4-1 standard, you also have the 4-2 technical security requirements. And these are literal standards that you certify both your processes to, but also your products. And so the 4-2, the 3-3, the 2-4, all of these are really critical for some people. And as a supplier, one of the things I like to stress to our customers is you should be looking for this in your suppliers. So I'm going to be talking about what you should be looking for in just a moment. So when you're looking at OT vendors, I can't cover everything today. It would be impossible. The amount of due diligence that everybody should be doing when you're talking at the supply chain level, it's really difficult to get it all into a single on-ramp presentation. So today I'll be focusing on secure development lifecycle, software bill of materials, vulnerability management, pen testing, and then really third-party risk, and lastly, the longevity. There is so much more that I'd love to cover, and I don't have time for that. So you can find out details in my book or anywhere on those points. But I simplified it today because I really feel that people are not doing the right level of due diligence when it comes to supply chain. And that means understanding product security, what that supplier is doing, what that vendor is doing. So secure development is not all the same. I love the 62443 standard. One of the reasons I love it is you can certify to it. It is the only secure development standard that you can certify to. So IT vendors that aren't 62443, how are they certifying their secure development life cycles? They're probably getting some assessments being done by some other folks. You can be assessed now against the NIST SSDF, the Secure Software Development Framework, but it's a framework with requirements and examples. It's not a standard that you can truly certify to. And also CISA has it secure by design. And we've been working with CISA on the operational technology pieces of that, because the secure by design has a lot of pieces that are designed and discuss IT specific things, and OT can be very different when it comes to cyber physical and other kinds of concepts. So just wanted to bring this to your attention. So when you are selecting a supplier, be looking for the 62443 certifications, especially 4-1. Okay, this is a passion for me. Software bill of materials. I'm not going to go into it and create a software bill of materials talk, but when you are purchasing a product, think of how many assets that you might have in your, let's just say, your environment. And do you know that when you're looking at all of these assets, if you have an asset inventory, there are tools that can do OT scanning, but I speak to people all the time and they don't want to risk scanning their environment. So they have been requesting software bill of materials, and companies like myself provide that under a non-disclosure agreement. And that means that a customer can look at that software bill of materials and see if it has Log4j, see if it has a .NET component in there. And it gives that visibility, not just in open source, but can also give it for proprietary items, and eventually you will be able to do some risk analysis. So I encourage you, as part of the supply chain, do ask for that software bill of materials so that you can understand it. And that way, before a security notice comes out that says maybe that product is affected, you might have at least an idea. And so those security notices are very important. Vulnerability management, there's actually 2 certifications that somebody could get for their organization, both on the handling that they do, but also the disclosure. So ask your suppliers, do you have these 2 certifications? And if they don't, I gave you a few ideas. Check if they have a vulnerability disclosure policy on their website. All right, that's pretty common. It's going to be required in a lot of different things like the EU Cyber Resilience Act. Check if they disclose their own vulnerabilities. If you see that it's CISA or other people always disclosing their vulnerabilities, they probably don't have their own approval to do so, or they're not taking the initiative. And also see if there's a way to subscribe to their security notifications. So I said you can look at the SBOM to maybe get some idea, but you should be subscribing, especially for these critical products. There's not always a patch right away, or you may choose not to patch, but you need to understand the mitigations that are potentially out there, or what the actual notice says on what to do about this certain event. And so those are really important. So another thing from a supplier, and this is something that I see when we are looking at suppliers every day, we're purchasing operating systems and different components and different software and firmware and even brand labeling products. We ask, what kind of penetration testing have you done? We have a CREST accredited penetration lab, CREST accredited penetration engineers. What has that supplier done for that product? You can ask for the reports. Most suppliers will provide you a redacted version, which will show when they last performed that pen test. And we do get asked for that. And it's an important piece to ask your suppliers, because if you are purchasing something that you expect to live for 30 years, you want to know that there was some due diligence, because again, maybe you're not going to be patching it every 2 weeks or anything like that. And so I talked about this upstream supply chain, and I really like to always highlight, and I showed you that dramatic picture of what all the different suppliers could be, is that as a supplier, as a vendor, as anyone, you know that there's an upstream, and that risk means that it's not only my third parties, but who those third parties choose to be their suppliers. And that transparency is very important, but it's also really hard still. Understanding exactly all the suppliers that went into the design of that chip, that went into the manufacturing of that chip, what countries. So understanding your fourth party, fifth party, some, call it tier 2, tier 3, tier X. This is really important. So I like to talk about like suppliers as a marriage. Like you're not only getting that partner, you're also getting their family and all the history that goes into that. And that's really what you're seeing in the supply chain. So, you don't know if, uncle, whoever, may have ended up doing something that wasn't so great. But you're going to find out about it eventually as you get to know each other. And from a supply chain standpoint, this understanding of that, you really are marrying that supplier for a long time, because you're taking that product and you're actually implementing it into theirs. And we know from an OT standpoint, it's going to be there. And so that's why I'm going to talk about the longevity. So think about it. For our company, for example, almost 200 years old, right? So these operational technology vendors, who is supplying this? And we don't see, in critical infrastructure, there's quite a bit of vendors in the landscape, but, have they been around a long time? Do they have all of these pieces as part of that supply chain? How long do you expect them to be? I work with a lot of startups on different kinds of security tools and things like that. But when you're looking at, am I going to keep that product, let's say a car, for decades and decades? Do you want to risk a startup? Or, because you're not going to, in the case of operational technology, you're not going to be changing it out every 2 to 3 years, which you might be able to do from an IT perspective, right? So that longevity for operational technology vendors is highly critical. So when you're talking about just selection, I'm going to talk about that, and then I'm going to talk about monitoring. So selecting, this is just an example. I did a basic example of how you might select an OT vendor. Again, don't use eBay. The OT vendor selection process is very similar. There's really no difference from an IT. I mean, this kind of things could be exactly from an IT standard standpoint, but you're going to be looking at other different components, right? So that supply chain piece, when you want to know this support and maintenance. So I didn't talk too much about that. I talked about the vulnerability management, but is that company going to be around, and are they going to be able to provide you products for and versions and updates for a long time? You might want to weight that more. In this example, vendor B and vendor C were almost identical, except for vendor C has certifications. So think about this, especially from an operational technology standpoint, to think, how am I going to select that vendor? Because I then am having access to their whole supply chain, and I need to have confidence in them, not only from a security standpoint, but many other aspects about it. Are they financially solvent? Is there, something I need to be worried about? Do they, follow good practices? And that's all something that you can put in a scoring process. But what I often see is that people are forgetting about the monitoring. So there's many different ways to monitor. There can be, you can have monitoring of their IT landscape, which means that there's external companies that do that. You could have monitoring of the security notifications. I mentioned that that's pretty critical. Even if you are, let's just say you've got that same vendor, or you've got every single vendor, you need to be aware of what's going on. Not everything makes the news. All right, the big ones make the news, but there are other pieces that are just as critical in those security notifications. I love my SBOMs, so I really am encouraging you to really think about starting to collect these. There are many different kinds of tools that'll house this and give you that visibility. And then you've got security monitoring services. So in today's world, I said 20, 30 years, how is that going to take it down the line? What are you going to be able to do from an overall standpoint when you're on to your next job, or 5 years or 10 years down? If you don't put in routine practices to monitor that supplier and that supply chain, things are going to happen and there's not going to be that awareness. I would really challenge you to say, do you really know your asset inventory so that you could begin security monitoring? Do you have this in place? You might have picked, or somebody picked those products 20, 15, 10 years ago. And are you aware now what's happening in the world for that vendor, and are you monitoring it on a daily basis? And not just a standard, probably RSS feed, although those might work, but you really want to think about, how do I make some kind of prioritization? What's important to you? You know better than anybody else which ones probably are internet facing, which ones are connected between different platforms. You know, what is the critical pieces for your business, your organization, your infrastructure? And that's why the monitoring for that supplier, their products, as well as just monitoring your own area, and I'm just not seeing it very frequently. So from a key takeaway standpoint, I just want to bring this together and talk about the supply chain. So when you are selecting vendors, when you are thinking about your supply chain, it's not just today. You have to think about, what did I make a decision on 5 years ago? What did I make a decision on 10 years ago? Because you're already in that, right? So with the supply chain piece of this, you have to be aware. There are certain companies that maybe 10 years ago, they were pretty good at that. Are they keeping up to date with supply chain trends? Are they aware? Are they part of the community? Are they part of threat intel? Are they doing what's necessary when it comes to updates? Do they have the right practices in place? You know, are they certified? You're going to have to stay aware of what's going on, and that's why knowing your supply chain is very important, because you know, just say, like I said, tier 3, you know, third party tier, you know who I am, but do you know who I'm working with? And that's really where we're seeing the difference today. That's why supply chain is important. Look for those certifications. Don't ever forget about those. They are challenging to get, and many businesses may not have it yet because our customers aren't asking for that. Right? So you don't have that third-party assessment, and it's really important. When you're looking at selecting OT or IT or anything, make sure you're really making the decision not only on, you know, it's because we've already got 25 of these. Rethink that decision criteria. Is this still the right choice? Do I need to consult? Plus, it'll actually, you know, I think impress some other people to say, oh, we've taken this decision criteria. And then monitoring for risks, that's really important. I can't stress it enough, because in examples that we're seeing every day in the news, it's happening more and more that not the direct supplier was the one that was impacted, it's their supplier. And without naming certain controversies in different areas, I think we've all seen that. You know, you won't be able to get your doctor's bills paid because a supplier to pay those bills has not, has been compromised. So we're seeing that, and those are all supply chain attacks, whether or not you're doing that. And if you're not aware of who they are, I mean, you will find out as soon as their service goes down because they have a supply chain attack at a supplier. So at this point in time, I can take some Q&A. We'll take questions up at the mic right here. Anybody for questions? I see a question coming up.
Casey, good morning. Thank you very much. Interesting presentation. So the question then is, since supply chain, relies on many chains, so to speak. So what is the most effective way to do what you mentioned in terms of ensuring security? Is it like having one good auditor checking the work process, or how would you suggest going about? Thank you.
So to check the supply chain, there's many different ways to check that. I think if there's two different things. I like auditors for certification. I don't like auditors for compliance piece of this, because it really needs to be accountable. So if you are the decision maker or you're part of the team that's deciding to use a product or a supplier, you really own that risk. and an auditor coming in and saying, this is good. Now, if you don't have those skill sets, bringing in a consultant to be able to say, here's what you should be looking for. That's why I gave a lot of ideas today. But there's not a supply chain end-to-end certification or audit or anything that I feel is adequate enough at this point in time. So I recommend looking for that specific, you can use auditors, but I don't feel like it's strong enough. So.
Right. Just to follow up on what you just said, as you know, smaller systems might not have such big an impact, but larger complex systems might involve, let's say, a EPC, a MAC, automation contractor, and then an SI, and a supplier such as Schneider, Honeywell, and the likes, for example. And then you have an integrator as well, right? There's engineering. So the whole chain, how do you then, who's the one that you mentioned, the person to go to? Thank you.
Yeah, so they're from a supply chain and all of those people involved, you can make it some requirements in your projects. I have been working with NICET and NSPE, the National Society for Professional Engineers, on a certification called SSI, System Software Integrator, where that person is certified like an engineer and accountable. But if not, I recommend also putting it in the actual project documents, because third-party risk, it's usually very high level, but how they do due diligence, supplier management, and everything, make it a contractual requirement. And I think we've got our next group coming in. So,
thank you.
So thank you all for coming today.